oh no, we have AI projects. We don't know if we can release them. We don't know how we're going to use these things. And they got very panicky and wondering, you know, what next? So from that, I realized there was a marketplace and actually a real big area just of figuring out what do we do around AI risk management.
Welcome back to another installment of the Next Gen Case Study Series. On today's episode, we have Ken Fricklas, who is a seasoned technologist and serial entrepreneur, currently serving as the board member at Safe Access. With a rich career spanning several decades, Ken has co-founded multiple tech companies, including PlaceWise Worldwide and Radiance. He brings extensive experience in cloud computing, IoT, cybersecurity, and smart cities, alongside holding various leadership roles such as CTO and VP of engineering at many innovative organizations. He is also a sought-after advisor for startups, contributing to AI safety and technology-driven initiatives, which is why we're excited to have him on the show. Ken, welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you for having me. Yeah, I just want to say I got into AI not because I wanted to be buzzword compliant. I got into AI because I was kind of using it all over the place. And I was working for Google for some time as a senior program manager over all of measurement in Google search. And when I left there, I found myself involved in a bunch of AI projects. And what was interesting there was we would go do these projects, and then these companies would come back and say, oh no, we have AI projects. We don't know if we can release them. We don't know how we're going to use these things. And they got very panicky and wondering, what next? So from that, I realized there was a marketplace and actually a real big area just of figuring out what do we do around AI risk management. And so, yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing these days, is mostly in the AI risk management. I still serve in a couple of fractional C roles, and I'm on a few boards.
Okay, so given that you have such a colorful background, I wonder if we could get just a couple of minutes, Cliff Notes version on, who you are, where you came from, and how you kind of found yourself in this space.
Sure. So I was one of those guys who, when the internet happened and Netscape went public, we all quit our jobs and said, we're going to go create internet companies. And my first one was a short-lived Hollywood-based venture that produced online soap operas. But there was a spinoff from there. It was actually my first CTO role, which was called Disinformation, which was kind of the search engine of anything weird. It got very popular for a while. And from there, I went into co-founding a company that did medical practice management, and eventually started PlaceWise, which was most of my career. It was originally PC Menu and then MallFinder, eventually PlaceWise, but it's the biggest company that's both does websites, and it's also a data repository and data marketplace for shopping or physical malls. That company's still around. I was there for quite a while, and the other roles which sort of came out of there were lots of other companies I won't get into, but sort of the big roles were as an innovation lead at Cable Labs, which is kind of Bell Labs for cable television. And after that, that was when I went to work for Google. But along the way, having been very involved in the entrepreneurial scene here in Colorado, I wound up with many board positions, many advisory roles, and I still do a lot of, mostly on the technical side, but around technical governance, which is how I wound up becoming a professor at Denver University. And I now teach AI governance and safety.
Okay, and so now with your role serving as the board member of Safe Access, Ken, I'm kind of picking up on you acting as an advisory to a lot of different businesses because you have a deep and rich knowledge of a very specific kind of set of topics. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I have gotten into trouble in every way possible, and I'm getting good at telling other people how to avoid making the same mistakes. And honestly, I feel like that, you know, a lot of people get onto boards thinking that your job is to go brainstorm the next thing people are going to do and somehow, provide that direction. I actually think that makes for ineffective boards. What you want to do is enable organizations to be able to make decisions effectively and have them dig in places where you think they might be problematic. Now, I have lots of friends who are board members who are really good at combining the two. Like if you ask the right questions, they usually come to your conclusion, or at least they change your mind along the way. But that's kind of the goal. It's to say, okay, you want to go do this thing, and you're going to go reinvest all of next year's basically free money into going and building this thing. maybe the all-in approach isn't the best way to do this. Maybe we need to be a little bit more agile and find a small group of customers and do some focus and then build a prototype to figure out whether this is really the right thing, right? I mean, it's all of these things where it's just kind of like being the balance to the goals of the organization itself to make sure that they take the most effective path. The risk tends to be, oddly enough, on the risk management side, which is if you're overly conservative, that can be problematic as well. I was working with an organization recently who basically decided what they want to do is maximize their short-term profits because they wanted to move into sales, and they basically selling a company, I mean. And they pretty much cut off all of their next generation development. And part of the conversation became, anybody who buys you is going to want to know that you actually have a future. So maybe that's not actually the best route to getting the company sold if you actually want to pass due diligence. These are the kind of questions which come up a lot.
So I have this idea that you've had experience all the way across the board from, scrappy startup, VC capital, all the way up to, publicly funded big company that, a lot of people making decisions, big ship to steer. I wonder if we could kind of explore some of the strategies for growing these different types of companies from those different perspectives, like that first chunk of work that you have to do versus, now that you're looking for an exit, there's a different set of things that are important. So what does that look like from your experience?
So, okay. So one thing is to be very aware of what stage you're in. And by what stage you're in, that doesn't necessarily mean what stage the whole company is in. It means for this initiative, where are you at? So any company that wants to have a growth path, it doesn't matter how far along, basically should have a set of startups with those agile principles applied inside that little startup piece, the next generation development, right? The worst thing that you can possibly do, in my opinion, is get a bunch of seasoned sales guys together, have them get a discussion and start selling something that you haven't built or tested on customers yet. Doesn't matter how good your focus groups are. Doesn't matter if you got a product management manager attached to it. It's not the same as actually getting people to have their hands on some piece of what it is you're building and seeing whether it works. So when you're a startup, that's your whole business, right? And the interesting thing about all of these, I think the most important thing I've learned in like 30 plus years is everything is stakeholder management. It is like being aware of what information you need from who and making sure that they have input at the appropriate time. And it doesn't matter if that's your board or if that's your customers or if that is the HR department. It's like at some point, you need to say, this is a decision which I should not be making assumptions about, right? And so that comes back to, and again, another really important function of a board, figure out when somebody is saying something assumed and try to figure out, frequently it's just a conversation they need to have, but whether or not that thing they think is true is actually true, right? They've got a narrow perspective. Best CEOs I've ever run into are the ones who ask everybody every possible question, even about their ground assumptions, because they're going to learn the most and they're going to pivot early enough, or at least try multiple paths to be able to get to a more interesting solution. And we're in a world right now where things are accelerating like crazy. I mean, we've got, especially with artificial intelligence, I've been telling companies, don't assume that your technical leadership position, unless you have some really unique IP, is going to be so we used to be able to say that would give you a leader's advantage for about 3 to 5 years, right? And then you needed to worry about pivoting or doing something to be able to lock in your customers. So you don't have to worry about it. That's down to about 6 months. So we're now in a point where by the time you close your sales, you may have a competitor if he caught on to what you're doing. That's not a great situation to be doing, right? To be in. So what's your differentiator? Your differentiator is solving problems for your customers in a way that makes them have a closer relationship with your organization. And, and the traditional thing has been, well, we'll do things so it's really hard to move off our platform. And that still works if you're Salesforce or HubSpot or a lot of other guys that are relatively hard to configure. It doesn't work great for almost anybody else, right? If you're a company, as one I was dealing with recently, who just basically build form management that you can drop into HubSpot. When they started, they had like one competitor. And they were like, oh, we can beat them on this stuff. Well, they have a whole lot of competitors now. It's only been about 2 years, and there's like a dozen players in the marketplace. So you got to be careful about those things where it's like, just because you've done something, if other people can glom onto it, development has changed. You can get there fast, or at least be able to fake being there fairly fast. So the user experience is the same, even if, it's going to take more work on the back end to actually make things work. So we've kind of got a new world. And so part of the question here is, if you're on the executive team, or if you're the board trying to manage the executive team, what does that look like for you? How do you have to change the way you relate to the entire organization in such a way that that becomes an advantage for you rather than the biggest possible fail? If you're on a board that's only meeting every 6 months, you probably have a huge problem on your hands unless people are tasked with taking specific roles around governance inside the organization that continue in between those meetings. But the days of the annual board meeting have kind of gone away, in my opinion, at least for anybody relatively small.
Well, the thing that you pointed at here is some level of accountability inside of the leadership team to make sure that innovation continues to happen, but then also in service of the endpoint, right? The customer, the person that you're looking to serve. And the thing that you said that I don't want to gloss over is, yeah, you can create something that's really great, and then in 6 months there's another dozen people doing it. And so what makes you different, or what makes you special? And the thing that you pointed at was your ability to solve problems that your clients have in a way that wants them to continue to do business with you. And this points at a common theme that from a lot of people that I've talked to over the hundreds of conversations I've had is really what this is about is creating a remarkable experience, something worth sharing with somebody else. And if you can craft a path for your customers to follow that creates those remarkable experiences throughout their time with you, that's the path towards success. So, with that in mind, Ken, I'd love to get your perspective on what the ideal customer experience map looks like. Maybe that's generally speaking, or go granular, and maybe let's examine some of the work that you're doing with safe access and how you're kind of guiding the shaping of that customer experience path.
Yeah, so let me take this down. Like, there's essentially two ways. Well, there's two things that have to happen, right? So
Mhm.
part one is you need to solve problems for your customers in a way that they understand that, number one, you understand their problem, and number two, that those tools will actually solve their problem. So there's sort of the marketing training piece of this, which is that it doesn't do you any good to be the right solution if it's not understood that that stuff works. So that's, doesn't matter how remarkable this is if nobody knows that you're actually solving their problem. And then there's two ways to get there. So one is with very fast development with a completely bespoke system where you can basically respond to customer requirements as quickly as possible,
Mhm.
which, based on what I was talking about earlier, is getting harder and harder to do because those development cycles get faster and faster. And the problem is, unless you have deeply entrenched customers, if you're releasing new functionality every 2 weeks, your customers can't keep track of that information coming that fast, right? This is why, Miro, for an example, company I really like, they tend to have these either annual or half annual. So does companies like Adobe meetings where they basically announce all of their new functionality. And they may have been rolling out for a while, okay, if you're paying attention. But that's where they're like, well, let's go catch the customer experience. Let's catch the fact that the customers now understand what our goals are. And part of that is not being closed mouth about your roadmap. The old, we're going to hide our roadmaps and nobody copies it, starting to get to be a bad idea because you're going to lose customers. They may be entrenched enough that they're willing to wait 3 months to get your new feature. But if they don't know it's coming, you may lose them in the meantime. So anyways, that's one side. It's all the customer communications, right? The other side is, how do you get the customer to their solution as quickly as possible? So there's two basic tacks there. One is we're going to solve 80% of the problems using 20% of the software, and then we'll go provide custom services to get you the other 20%. That can work pretty well with very large customers. It does not work well broadly. So the best way to get you there, my opinion, is create a developer ecosystem. So you look at people like Git and Slack. What have they done? They're like, we're going to allow these plugins that basically you can do just about anything with our back end we may wind up replacing some of the better ideas with stuff that's just built into the core platform. But in the meantime, you can build a whole ecosystem around what we're doing. Why? It's not so much to create those ecosystem vendors who provide the additional functionality. It's because it allows your customer to get to their solution without you having to get personally involved with everybody if you've got 5 million customers. See what I mean?
Mm.
Because that's a lot of work. So it's like let the ecosystem do the work for you. So how does this work if you're a plane manufacturer? Okay, it starts getting a little bit more complicated. Creating the API is not necessarily the best idea, but what might be a good idea along the way is create a partnership ecosystem with other organizations who can customize certain aspects. They might be able to customize your navigation systems or the upholstery that you put inside your plane if you're trying to do something which appeals to a high-end crowd. That's a way of saying, okay, we don't want to be a closed ecosystem anymore because the closed ecosystem isn't going to allow, from the customer's point of view, us to innovate fast enough to meet their needs.
Mm.
So, in my opinion, that's actually a really big change. So, when I looked at Safe Access, so Safe Access was a company that initially started during COVID, and the idea was to be able to allow companies. So, I don't know if you remember, but everybody had to like fill out these questionnaires. Do you have a fever today? You know, have you been tested? Blah, blah, blah. And the idea was great. We have all these empty buildings now, and nobody wants you even communicating with them unless you've passed all these tests. We spun out of a company which was producing basically ways that people could refit for energy usage their buildings, a company called Retrolights. And what was funny about that was we were sitting there going, well, this is the best possible time for people to go refit because there's nobody in the buildings. But none of these companies had any business because it was impossible to do that safely. So we were like, all right, let's build a company that basically allows people to fill out these forms online. They can walk in, take their temperature using a sensor, and then the door gets unlocked and they're allowed access in there. So we're basically doing access control during COVID was why it's called Safe Access. That, as things started to open up, evolved into a company which allowed people to go safely for people who are managing large events to allow people to self-identify as following best practices because we were still under COVID restrictions when they were going to the events to basically tell people, hey, if you're sick, we'd rather you didn't show up. So we evolved in that direction. So this was one of those pivots where we went down and we said, well, we have this technology that already allows these kinds of things. There is a side group we were already talking to, which were these people who are running large scale events. And another organization was one of our biggest clients, which was a project more than anything, that was called COVID Check Colorado. And COVID Check Colorado was brought in by the state of Colorado to basically, it started out of a brainstorming session with the state, which is how do we provide as many COVID tests as possible for free to the general public? So it was a fairly complicated thing, but we needed the ability for the people who are working for us to do that self-identification. They actually became a client of Safe Access. Denver Public Schools became a client of Safe Access. You know, there were a number of people who were like, we've all got the same problem, which is that we don't want people on our premises unless they're safe. And so you start thinking about these things and you go back to the technology and think, well, what is our technology essentially useful for in other ways in the post-COVID world? And so where we've landed now is we're actually reaching out to a bunch of different organizations to find people who need something similar, which is the ability to do online document management and a few other things, be able to dig into online databases and create people who are compliant with a set of rules, which are not now COVID rules. So an example of this one direction that we're going in is working with large scale real estate companies who want to make sure that their suppliers are actually compliant with the contracts which they've been given to go say you will do the following things. And we want to make sure those are read and they actually sign off. And those things are actually remarkably hard to manage. So the idea is, especially when you're doing impromptu events, how do we make that work? So why does this relate in any way, shape, or form to everything we've just been talking about, right? So we've got several pivots here, but in every case, it was like, okay, we have a core technology. Let's find a way that people can incorporate this in such a way that we provide part of the service, but not the entire service, right? Let's provide for a specific need based on customer feedback that gets us to the goal, which is making our core product accessible. and we don't want to own the ecosystem. Our partners are the things that are going to make this ecosystem effective, right? So in the first case, our partners were the people who were actually doing various kinds of retrofitting, and it was the building managers, or it was COVID Check Colorado and the school system, or it was, so in each one of these cases, it's like go in, find out what their needs are, and either become the supplier to them or to their customers,
Mm.
right? So it's like don't own the business model until you own the product.
Right. There's this resilience, I think, that comes from it. I remember, and not that I was hoping for failure or anything, but I did recognize during that COVID period that there was an inevitability to any business that had started as a result or directly connected to something related to COVID, because this can't last forever. There has to be the other side of the rainbow, or the light at the end of the tunnel. Eventually, things are going to shift back to some level of normalcy. So, what are those businesses going to do? And Ken, hearing firsthand from you that hey, here's an obvious pivot that something like safe access can do that is still going to be useful overall under a very similar premise that hey, we need people to self-govern for the purpose of safety and compliance for some reason. And so we can create a tool that bridges that gap and creates those connections in the real world. So
Right.
that's really exciting.
And the board connection there was what questions should these people be asking to go find these adjacent opportunities, right? And do it early enough that you don't run out of runway. So that other organization I was talking about, COVID Check Colorado, that was built to be shelved, right? I mean, we got up to hundreds of employees. But the fact was, the whole idea was let's shut this thing down. And every 6 months or so, we would have a board meeting around
How
how do
close?
we, what's the shutdown plan? What does this look like? How can we switch this over so the state themselves are doing it? Who are our core customers who are going to continue to need us for a while, which turned out to be rural areas? It was all of this stuff, which was, was very much a need-based organization, but it wasn't ever meant to have a long-term business model, right? So
Right.
if you're going to have that long-term business model, you got to think about what that growth looks like and which additional customers you can add, and in what direction are you adding by providing more products to the same customers? Are you adding adjacent customers? Or are you doing a full pivot where you're basically saying, hey, we have core technology. Let's just go find a whole new world it can live in.
Hmm. Ken, we only have a few minutes left here, and this has been incredibly insightful, very valuable. There's a lot of stuff that you shared, and I'm disappointed we didn't get to go as deep as I was hoping because there's some things here. So maybe we reschedule and get you on for a second episode. But to kind
I
of
love that.
put a bow on this and kind of package it up, um, I wonder if looking forward into the work that you're doing, you could share some of the important stuff that you're kind of excited about that you're developing or that is coming down the pipeline. In the spirit of before, as you mentioned, it's important to kind of give that roadmap. So what are you working on and what are you excited about?
So yeah, it's funny because this is sort of relates to the consulting that I do right now.
Mm,
So I feel like the most interesting stuff right now, and it's a two-phase thing. So first one is we have lots of companies working in the AI space, and they are starting to create enablers for any other company to reinvent really any portion from your marketing to your internal operations to you name it, using AI to transform what you can do.
mm,
So I feel like the single most important thing for you to be able to do there is imagine beyond the bounds of what you think your technology organization can do. Just throw out all the assumptions about the last 20 years and start just saying, well, gee, it'd be cool if we could do this, and then ask if that's possible. So I've been working with a number of companies which are kind of going in some very interesting new directions. A weather company, which is, building applications which provide personalized weather forecasts that relate both to where you are and what you can do with it. Really interesting application, right?
mm,
Um, Boats that basically float themselves around and follow the fish based on sensor data. There's just all of these things which, if you were trying to do this 10 years ago, would have been incredibly expensive to do. And now it's just like, no, it's a relatively inexpensive application that you might be able to go throw on your fishing boat for $3,000. Um, these are the kind of things which are like, wow, we are definitely living in a new world. So part of it is, excuse me, don't self-edit. That's my first piece of advice there. And that is really interesting and exciting stuff, I've got to say. Right. And then the other piece of it is kind of go in and don't think of it in terms of what can AI do for me? Leave that up to your technical folks to be able to come up with those kinds of conversations. Start with, what would our customers like that we can't do right now because we think it's impossible, and find out if that's really true anymore.
Really great. That's exciting.
So you're
Ken,
asking new questions, right? All the
yeah.
questions you were afraid to ask before, you know.
But now we have the technology and the capability to answer that with something that actually is genuinely plausible. And I think that that's what's most exciting about the prospects that you've kind of laid out is that a lot more is possible with the right team, with the right knowledge, with the right access to the right tools. And so, what that looks like in the coming days is, as you mentioned, very exciting. Ken, if somebody wanted to reach out to you to pick your brain further or perhaps work with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
So the easiest way to get to me is via my LinkedIn is just Ken Fricklas, and my email, which you can get to off of there anyway, is ken at gotura.co. So it's go Turaco. Um, and yeah, I'd love to hear from some folks. Engage with me on LinkedIn or elsewhere. I'm, very happy to continue the conversation.
Wonderful. We'll make sure to link to that in the show notes so that anybody watching or listening will be able to find you easily. On that note, if you want to reach out to me and my team for any of your AI or marketing needs, you can visit nextgengrowth.com. Otherwise, that's it for this episode. Thanks for joining us for this conversation, and I will see you in the next.